So as we're moving on from discussing structuring experiences and lessons with environmental education, one of the components that we have to discuss that's critical in all aspects of education is assessment and or evaluation, right? And there's times that unfortunately assessment or evaluation can be a little bit of an afterthought, but it's really critical and it's something that we want to be very intentional about. Something I unfortunately see fairly often within schools or lessons is you'll see sometimes experiences that have the potential to be really powerful, but the assessment component is kind of bungled where it gets watered down at the end, right? Or the assessment component can misdirect the lesson or experience. And so we do want to be very intentional and thoughtful about assessment, and especially consider how that might look a little bit different within the context of environmental education compared to other things we might teach. Elliot Eisner, the great curriculum theorist and scholar, argued that assessment reveals the most about what we value as an educator. So within a school, what we assess and how we assess reveals the most about what we really care about. One of the things that's kind of surprised me or perhaps disheartened me a little bit is I've had times that I'll visit schools and they'll say things like, we really value critical thinking, we really value blank. And then when you look at their assessment, it's multiple choice, it's matching, it's something that doesn't match the values they claim. Or they'll say we really value growth, but their assessment strategy only allows students one opportunity to take an assessment, right? And so whether intentional or not, how and what we assess reveals so much about what we truly value as educators. And so we want to start with, although this isn't an easy goal, there's always this discussion of what's the best assessment. And in this case, I'm going to argue that the best assessment is the one that most authentically captures the understanding and skills which we intended for the lesson to develop. Now, there are times that there are, of course, limitations, right? So maybe the way that most authentically captures this is they would plan and execute and build a school garden, right? And tend to it for 6 months. And that would be the best way of showing you that they understand the importance of water and nutrients and soil, right? Something like that. But maybe that's just not practical, right? For a lot of reasons. You're like, okay, well, I can't really wait 6 months to see if they understand this. Or it's April, I can't, right? The school year ends, we don't, right? So there's always limitations, but that is, I think, the goal that we want to aim toward. I want to be very clear about that in that the best assessment is not necessarily the one that is easiest or quickest for the teacher, right? So there's times that unfortunately the assessment that gets chosen is chosen for convenience. And I'm not diminishing at all of the burdens teachers have on their schedules. I completely understand that. I've been there. In a lot of ways, I still am there in my role. But what makes an assessment right is that it captures and allows students to demonstrate the skills we needed to demonstrate, not that it's convenient. If it can be both, wonderful, but the matching the skills and understanding is much more important than the convenience. So what I want to suggest is a focus towards authentic assessment, right? And so this is assessment that instead of just focusing on retention of knowledge, because that's still hanging on that gamble that the retention of knowledge is going to lead to action, right? Which we've already discussed several times, not the case. Also, as we can get too focused on that, students have the potential to worry less about the action or the understanding and focus more on just what's going to be on an assessment. Now, assessment like this of complex tasks is going to be subjective. We'll discuss this a little bit, but assessment is always subjective. There's times that teachers will act as though it's their test is objective, and it's just not. Standardized tests are not objective, right? We hear about studies looking at biases within standardized tests, and and although they try to remove some of those biases, there's others that absolutely are there. We all know, or perhaps you yourself are someone that will say you don't test well, right? You have knowledge that isn't captured on tests because you get anxious, or just the nature of a multiple choice high stakes test isn't an environment in which you thrive your best, right? Assessment is always subjective. We're going to be honest about the fact that in assessing authentic tasks that we're being subjective. The big risk if we dilute the quality of the assessment to try to appear objective, we really risk diluting the quality of the entire learning experience. So this picture was students using, they had DIY stream tables at an after-school science program. They were using different materials to try to reduce erosion. I mean, they're all like household type things, but just experimenting with it a little bit, right? There was a lot of understanding that came through it. Like one of the patterns of things the students tended to notice quite a bit, and I should pause and not take credit for this was one of my students, a future teacher who led this and planned this, is that a lot of the things that tried worked kind of and then failed catastrophically, which is not that dissimilar from what can happen with some actual, dams and erosion reduction techniques, right? That when they fail catastrophically. And so that understanding was really powerful. And there was a lot of great discussion in that. Even some kids that built ideas that failed, right? That it didn't work in the sense of stopping erosion, still developed great understanding. A multiple choice test about having them describe different types of erosion or matching or whatever would have lost so much of that understanding, right? That understanding they gained through the activity would get diluted and lost. They also, if you can imagine, maybe, if they do the activity, they do really well, they build a great understanding, they feel engaged, they feel like they're making great observations. And then we do a matching test, which again, doesn't capture the actual like skills as far as like experimentation that we wanted, and they do poorly on it. Their confidence or belief in what they learned is going to be much lower. Even though the things we actually cared about, the authentic elements, they did well. Right? So authentic assessment, it's going to be subjective. And it's one of those things we have to get right, because if we mess up the assessment component, we're going to dilute the whole experience. So a big idea I want to give you, right? Because again, the challenges that we think when we give a multiple choice test or matching or something like that, that we're being objective, we're not. But the real antidote to subjectivity in assessment isn't trying to hide that or obscure that. or even hide behind something that we're pretending objective. It's dialogue, right? Not watering down the experience to something that we feel like we can pretend is objective, but it's dialogue, right? So it's saying, hey, I'm looking at what you did here, and I'm not quite sure I understand why, or I'm not quite sure you understand this element. Can you tell me more about it? Can you revise it? Can you make this more clear to me? Right? Because maybe that in some cases is a student going, what do you mean? I really don't understand that. And we have an opportunity where maybe we need to teach more, right? And then we reassess. Or perhaps it's a time that the student understands perfectly well, and they immediately turn around and tell you, and you go, awesome, wonderful. I'm sorry, I just misunderstood, right? Dialogue is the key to subjectivity and assessment, not trying to water down the experience. So some guiding principles of assessment here for environmental education. If our goal of environmental education is action, not just knowledge, it's action, we need to put a greater emphasis on skills and understanding, not necessarily the product itself, right? So if it's becoming a poster, the neatness of the poster isn't really representative of the skill of communicating an environmental challenge, right? Perhaps depending on what it is, that the grammar within writing is less significant than the skill of using multiple pieces of evidence. Most of the skills that we are likely interested in, there are multiple ways students could demonstrate that. It could be a skill related to using evidence. It could be a skill related to making observations. It could be a skill related to communicating ideas about environmental, right? There's likely multiple ways of doing that. And if the goal is to make sure we're assessing that students are developing those skills, we can let them demonstrate those skills in multiple ways, right? So if your goal of the skill is communicating information about an environmental challenge, if one student writes that as an essay, if one student does it as an artwork, if one student does it as a video, and those all capture the skill of communicating environmental information, that's perfectly fine. Now, maybe some of those media, you go, wow, that's going to be a little bit tough for me to see this skill fully. And when a student says, okay, I want to make a painting, and maybe you're going to have a discussion of, okay, if you're going to make a painting, I'm going to maybe need you to come in and tell me about this painting to make sure I understand it fully. These skills also are likely being developed on varying timelines. So there's very much the potential that maybe some student needs multiple tries to demonstrate a skill. Maybe it's going to take them a little bit longer, and that's fine. Maybe some students can demonstrate a skill very quickly, and that's also okay. Maybe the depth of a particular skill is going to vary between students, right? You have sort of a minimum level of what it is you want students to demonstrate in terms of using evidence, but maybe there's some students that you're really going to encourage to use evidence in a more deep way, or maybe different types of evidence. Right. Now, each of these elements are all subjective. And again, the antidote for subjectivity is dialogue, not watering down the experience to something that is apparently objective. Ultimately, again, if our goal of environmental education is action, we want the assessment to point toward action in a way that's as authentic as possible, as meaningful as possible, and really demonstrates the skills that actually matter, right? And that likely looks very different than a lot of assessment that takes place in schools, and that's fine. It's also a really wonderful thing that it gives an opportunity for more students to succeed with topics like this, that maybe are students that don't always feel successful with some of the types of assessments that we're more accustomed to in schools. again, assessment reveals a lot about what we really care about. And so as much as possible, we want to be intentional about it. We want to make sure that it doesn't become an afterthought that really reduces the overall impact of our work in environmental ed.